Hello and welcome to the April update on YouTube live stream. This is going to be a really exciting one. I'm super excited about something that I'm going to show you in a little bit of time. I will hint at the fact that it's a new project called Rimbë. And if you're watching after the fact, you can skip right to the demo. I'll include time codes in the description. But I hope you'll watch through the other brief updates as well. Of course, those of you who are watching live, you don't have a choice. You'll have to wait. But thank you very much for joining us here today for this particularly exciting update. Okay, let's get into it. So there's a few things that I want to talk about briefly beforehand. First of all, though, I want to wish a very special birthday to Percy, who is 1 year old today. Percy is actually the youngest follower of the Digital Tolkien Project and a potential future collaborator. And maybe in a few years' time, he'll watch this video and see the shout out to him. So happy birthday, Percy. I hope you have a wonderful day and of course, many, many more to come. Okay. But let's get on with the rest of it. So first of all, I want to talk about the Tolkien Society Awards. Many of you are aware that the Digital Tolkien Project was again shortlisted for the awards in the category of Best Online Content, which I'm extremely honoured about. We didn't end up winning, but that's fine. I'm always happy at who does win in that category. And so a special congratulations to Nerd of the Rings, but also to everyone who won in their categories and was even shortlisted. So a shout out to Sarah Brown, who won again for Best Article. But there were some fantastic shortlistings there, even within my own category. I'm a huge fan not only of Matt at Nerd of the Rings, but also Robert at In Deep Geek, and of course Jordan Rennells, who's done such an amazing job and continues to do such an amazing job with his soundscape work. And I also want a special shout out to Tom Hillman, whose book that was shortlisted but did not win. Under very difficult circumstances, that book category. But I can't say enough good things about Tom Hillman's book. It's an interesting, the Tolkien Society Awards are kind of interesting. There's been a lot of discussion about the categories, especially the book category, but even the online content category is kind of interesting because the sort of stuff that Jordan's doing is very different from the kind of stuff I'm doing, and the kind of stuff I'm doing is very different from what Matt and Robert are doing with their content creation. Ultimately, I'm just thrilled to get the recognition for this, that the project gets this recognition. Ultimately, I want to build the tools that are used by the Tolkien Society Award winners. That's really my goal more than anything else. I just want to make sure that the resources that we're producing as a project are useful to scholars and content creators and others. I also want to say that some other updates. I've started a new little series on YouTube that I'll probably do roughly once a month as well, called Delving into the Little Delvings, where I go through whatever the Little Delvings that we've produced in the last month have been and talk a little bit more about how they were produced and some interesting insights that those may give us. So I'm not going to talk a ton about Little Delvings in this or future monthly updates because there's a dedicated playlist for those, and I'll add to that monthly. And they'll be pre-recorded, but that's a great opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the Little Delvings and get people's feedback. One of the reasons I wanted to do it was for people that just watch on YouTube to be able to see the Little Delvings that also get posted to Instagram and various other social media accounts. If you're not familiar with Little Delvings, I should just quickly say, Little Delvings are infographics that get produced from the information that we work with and work on in the Digital Tolkien Project. So it's a nice little way, I think, of sort of, in a nutshell, bite-sized little bits of information that you can get from the annotations that we're doing. They're always fun and often lead to some interesting discussions about the text, which is ultimately what we're all about. I do want to also quickly mention that we're getting really close to 1,000 Instagram followers in the last few weeks, and I was wondering if maybe we could get to 1,000 on this live stream. As it turns out, we got to 1,000 this morning. I woke up this morning and we'd hit 1,000. We're over 1,000 now. So thank you very much, everyone, for following on Instagram. That's a great way of getting those aforementioned Little Delvings as you're scrolling through Instagram. You can see some fun stuff there. Another thing I want to mention is there we go. I forgot that I had a picture of I took a screenshot when we hit the 1,000 followers on the Digital Tolkien Project. The other thing I just want to briefly mention before we get to the main event is that I am currently, for the second round, co-hosting the Prancing Pony podcast with Alan Sesto. The first of the episodes that I feature on dropped last Sunday, and they'll continue to come out every week for the next 5 Sundays, I guess. So thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to have me on the podcast, and I hope people who are listening to it are enjoying particularly the jokes that I make at Alan's expense about how old he is. Bit of a running gag there. Okay. I also want to briefly mention 2 more things. One is that my space class on the history of the Hobbit is starting, the first of them, it's going to be 3 separate modules because it's a big book, as you know. I'll be starting teaching the first of those next week. Next Thursday is when the History of the Hobbit class will start. And I'm always excited about teaching these kinds of classes because they give me an excuse to do more work on the text and further the Digital Tolkien Project work on the History of the Hobbit, which I think is going to lead to some interesting explorations of the different versions of the text and so on. And then finally, I just want to mention that I have switched on YouTube memberships. So if you are wanting to support this channel, one thing you can do is to click join under any of the videos. There's 3 tiers available that offer various perks. There's not a ton more that I'm going to say about it. I don't necessarily, I'm not great at promoting this kind of stuff. But if you are looking at ways of potentially supporting the channel, then YouTube memberships is a way of doing it. There's also, by the way, what I guess YouTube calls super thanks on individual videos. If you ever want to kind of give a tip for a particular video, you can do that as well, and that helps just in a small way to support this channel in particular. I'm also looking at other ways of funding various aspects of the Digital Tolkien Project, but certainly if you're interested in supporting this channel, memberships and super thanks are available. Okay, I got through all of that pretty quickly because I want to focus mostly on the main event, which is a new project within the Digital Tolkien Project, a new tool that I think is going to be pretty significant for all the work that we do. The project is called Rimbë, and you may be wondering, what is Rimbë? You can probably guess that it's an Elvish word, it's a Quenya word. And it's the Quenya word for crowd. And the reason that I chose that word is that Rimbë is a tool for basically doing crowdsourced text annotation. We obviously have been doing a lot of annotation over the years, an increasing number of people have contributed to that, which is absolutely wonderful. And we've had various ways of doing that. I've built various tools for some people, and sometimes we've used Google Docs for doing various things. But Rimbë, I think it's going to be the future of pretty much all of the annotation and crowdsourcing work that we do. And I want to talk a little bit about it and show off the current state of it. It's less than 3 weeks old, I think. I think I started it on Friday 2.5 weeks ago. But let me talk a little bit about the sort of origins and why I did it and what it can do, and then we'll take a look at a demo. So, these are examples of the sort of recent Little Delvings. And, you'll see on the left-hand side, for example, we've got this display of mentions of Strider versus Aragorn. And that one on the left was simply done using Search Tolkien. Search Tolkien has an API, so Belladonna, the software that draws these, that I've talked about before, it uses the Search Tolkien API to just find out how many times in each book the word Strider appears versus the word Aragorn. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a very well-received Little Delving, another visualization that shows how much do not is contracted to don't in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. Now, these two are fun visualizations, but each of them raises interesting questions. So the one on the left is just searching for the word Strider versus Aragorn. It's not considering other names that he might be referred to as. It's not distinguishing when he's present versus just mentioned. And so there's all sorts of interesting questions that you could ask if you had that sort of information, not just is Aragorn mentioned, but is he there in that particular part of the story? Regardless of what he's referred to as well, right? Because he may be referred to one of his other names, he may be referred to via a pronoun or something like that. And of course, the one on the right, the question of when is do not contracted as don't, leads to the question, where is it contracted? In The Hobbit, it's almost always contracted. In Lord of the Rings, it's almost 50-50, right? In terms of when it's contracted versus when it's not. Sarah's telling me that I started on April 4th. So it is almost 3 weeks. 3 weeks tomorrow, I guess. In order to know who is contracting do not to don't, we need to know who's speaking in any particular part of the text. And of course, that's something that we did. This was actually a really good example of something we've crowdsourced in the past. A wonderful group of people, especially Pat Lusk and Maureen Dillon and Sarah Monnier, but a bunch of other people as well, contributed going through the text and working out who was speaking at every point. And of course, once we have that information about who's speaking at every point, we can get results like this, right? We can see that people like Bilbo and Sam and Barliman Butterbur and Bill Ferny always contract. Elves, dwarves, Gondorians, the Rohirrim never, ever contract. But then there's some people in the middle that sometimes contract and sometimes don't. This still raises more questions, though. For example, if you take Gandalf or Aragorn, right? Gandalf contracts do not to don't 20% of the time. Aragorn, 12% of the time. Does it depend on who they're talking to? Well, in order to ask that question, we need to know who they're talking to, and we don't have that kind of annotation yet. So there's all these things that we could ask deeper questions if we only had the text more richly annotated along the lines of particularly who's present in a particular scene in the book. And that was sort of the impetus for Rimbë. But just like even more broadly, over the years, if you go back, for example, to my various talks at MythMoot, most of these come from my MythMoot 2021 talk, but also at IMC Leeds, there's often times that I've presented information that very high-level information to do with sort of narrative and time. This one you can see in the top middle, time versus text in Lord of the Rings, was an attempt just at the chapter level to say what day the chapter is occurring in. And that was based on information from the Tolkien Gateway. But I always wanted to go to another level and say, right down to a paragraph, when is this happening? On the top right, you can see something from a talk I gave at IMC Leeds where I was talking about which characters are there in the scene, and I at each part of the book. And I didn't do that exactly. This was an approximation where I basically looked for who the subjects of the verbs were in the narrative as a rough estimate of who was actually in the scene. But what I always wanted to do was go back and actually annotate the scenes of who's present. So questions like where are they? Who's there? Where are they? What time is it? And that also, I mean, that involves looking at in the bottom right there. You can say I'm covering it up, but you can get a bit of an idea. There's various time indicators in texts, right, that say things like the next day or 2 weeks later or something like that, right? Yeah, I agree, Trotter. This is one thing. Tolkien may have had a bunch of issues, in some cases rightly so, with this sort of technology. But one of the things I'm sure he would have appreciated is the tracking of location and times and stuff like that. Thank you for that comment. It warms my heart to think that he would have enjoyed this sort of stuff. I also want to point out in the bottom left an example. This is something I did again in MythMoot 2021, where I was looking at things that were discussed in the Council of Elrond. So they don't happen on the narrative mainline, but they're discussed in the Council of Elrond, but they're also in the Tale of Years. And so there's sort of this interesting maze of connections between things that are mentioned in the Tale of Years and when they happen in the text or where they're talked about retroactively in the text and so on. There's all sorts of really interesting challenges here. Yes, and there's talk in the chat about where Merry is. That question, that whole video about what happened to Merry in chapter 1 of Lord of the Rings, that whole question came about trying to do this kind of thing. So, which actually is a nice segue into the next slide, which is this whole idea of scene segmentation. So for quite a long time, probably 5 years, I've wanted to do an annotation of the texts that essentially does what might be described as scene segmentation, breaking up the various scenes, working out who's there, what location is it, what time's it taking place in. Right? The scene segmentation is kind of or scene annotation is kind of the broad name for all of this kind of stuff. And it was when I first started doing that I hit that problem of when does Merry leave? Right, because one of the things that we want to do in this scene annotation is for every scene you want to say what characters are there, who's arriving, who's departing, who's speaking, who's taking various actions, and it was that question of is Merry in the scene at the last parts of chapter 1 of Lord of the Rings that caused the problems and led me to do that video of what happened to Merry. So thank you for bringing that up. But there's other questions of location and movement. Even the video I did on Bilbo, the Hobbit, point of view in the Hobbit, is all to do with this, right? Where are they located? Whose point of view? Who are we following? That sort of stuff. When characters move, do we follow? I'm going to just hide myself for a moment just so you can see behind that. Schrodinger's Hobbit. Love it, Carl. Yes, he was in a superposition of being in Bag End and not in being in Bag End. The other aspect of all this is, of course, time. When are these things taking place? And you saw various visualizations on the previous slide of when certain things happened. And obviously that was something Tolkien cared very deeply about. We've seen his work on plotting out exactly what days everything was happening and where each character was and what the phase of the moon was and all that kind of stuff. But it's also interesting just from a sort of narratological point of view, how that information is conveyed in the text, right? So it's not just sort of the facts that you might get in a timeline, but how is some of that stuff expressed in the text? And that not only has to do with these little time indicators, but also choices of when Tolkien decides to present parallel things separately, right? I mean, at the largest scale, the decision to do the split between the books in Lord of the Rings. So there's obviously massive overlap in time between, essentially from books 3 onwards. But even the decision of what order to present certain things in, when to make jumps, when to give sort of blow-by-blow descriptions of things versus summary, all of those kinds of things are interesting questions, not just from the point of view of Tolkien scholarship, but also just sort of style in general. And many of you are aware that one of the areas of my own scholarship is studying Tolkien's writing style and the sort of decisions Tolkien makes linguistically to convey certain things. And one aspect of that is when does he choose to describe action versus simply a summary of movement. And how does he do that? And how does he kind of switch between those two? So all of this is something that I started to build Rimbë to annotate. I'd had discussions, as I mentioned, 5 years ago about this with particularly Paul O'Rear, and then a few years ago with Damien Romero, and then most recently Hannah MacDonald and I started to go through, and Hannah did a bunch of fantastic work in a Google Doc, just kind of laying out when were the various characters arriving and parting and stuff like that, kind of sketching out from a higher level what the scenes might be and so on. But then when I was thinking about coming back to that and how we were going to do that and share the load a bit more with regard to crowdsourcing this sort of information, that's when I realized what would be really nice is a tool for doing this annotation. And that's what led to Rimbë. One of the things that immediately became clear doing this is that, in this slide I've got here, you can see that information about characters and locations and times and so on are here tied to a scene. But we quickly ran into a problem of what constitutes a scene. When does the scene change? Sometimes it's really obvious when a scene is changing. When it's the next day, or when it jumps location, it switches from being, following Merry to following Pippin or something like that, right? But a lot of the time it's actually a little fuzzy because there's movement between characters. It's switching from that blow-by-blow action to summary and so on. And what we realized was, in order to determine where the scene boundaries were, we really needed to, first of all, get an understanding of who the characters present are, what's the location, what's the time, and so on. So there was this kind of circularity here where, on the one hand, we were trying to annotate scenes with characters, locations, and times. On the other hand, we needed to know the characters, locations, and times before we could determine whether it was a scene or not. And so what we really needed to do was actually annotate paragraphs with that sort of information, characters, locations, and time. Also, some things about is it real-time action? Is it a summary? Is it some background information? Because Tolkien will sometimes spend a paragraph or two giving you background information. Obviously, like the first few paragraphs of The Hobbit aren't happening on the narrative mainline. Their background. And so we thought if we annotated the paragraphs with that sort of stuff, then we could go back and get a sense of what the scenes were. Okay, enough talking about it. Let me actually show you Rimbë in its current state. And there's a few things I want to make clear before I dive into it. The first of all, that, as I've said, this is only a 3-week-old project. So this is very, very early days, and there's a lot more planned for this. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that what you're going to see is going to show the text. And I want to be really clear that there is not any intention whatsoever of exposing the text to the public. And in fact, even among the annotators, in many cases, what I'll try to do is not actually show the text, but just expect that the person will have a book in front of them or whatever. But what I'm going to show you here does show the text, and there'll be some cases when I can do that for annotators, but I obviously need to be really careful to do that within the scope of fair use for research purposes and so on. But this, I'm never going to be able to show the text. Well, not never, but certainly at the moment, I'm not planning to show the text with the results of the annotation. That's only happening as part of the sort of the annotation process. So with that in mind, let me switch over to the website. So one of the things that one thing we've done in this is individual chapters of the Lord of the Rings, which is where we've started. We've only been working on the 3rd and 4th chapter of Book 2 of Lord of the Rings to start with, just to build things out. And get ideas, although we'll expand the scope to a lot of other things. But we do a chapter at a time, and we're going to restrict the annotation tasks basically to a siloed chapter. That partly means we can limit who has access to it and so on. That's one of the reasons for doing it. But of course, the chapters aren't silos, right? They share locations and characters and so on. So we also have this notion of a world. A world is really just a container to put characters and locations and so on. And so they span multiple texts. And so the way that it works is you have individual texts like The Ring Goes South or A Journey in the Dark, and then you have this world, Arda, and the characters get put under Arda and then can be used in the various texts. So let me start off by going to a text. So this is sort of a summary of what's going on with the Ring Goes South, and we can drill into, I'll show you in a moment, the actual individual chunks, which are normally paragraphs, but could be stanzas of verse and letters and stuff like that. But we've also got the scenes, the characters, the locations, and everything is logged, and annotators can share notes with one another. So far this initial annotation work, just trying things out, working out how this should work, has been done with Hannah MacDonald and Sarah Monnier and myself. And that's true, Sarah. A chunk of the chunks of Bilbo singing. So let me drill in and actually show you sort of what the way things work. It's not particularly interesting in the case of the first chunk, which is just the chapter title. But if we take something like this, right? Later that day, the hobbits held a meeting of their own in Bilbo's room. Merry and Pippin were indignant when they heard that Sam had crept into the council and had been chosen as Frodo's companion. So this is the underlying text. I'll just collapse all these, and then I'll talk about the various sections in a moment. But first of all, there's a few things that you typically want to look at in these texts for this annotation, right? The later that day tells you the time. That day is referring to what day it was in the previous chapter, the Council of Elrond. So we know that it was October 25th. We also know who's present here. We know it's the hobbits, it's Bilbo's room. So it's going to be Merry, Pippin, Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo are in Bilbo's room. I want to point out that the Sam creeping into the council and being chosen as Frodo's companion is not happening at this point, right? That's something that did happen in the previous chapter. It's just being referred to here. So one of the important things we're doing is annotating what's actually happening in the mainline narrative in this paragraph. And what's happening there is the meeting, and Merry and Pippin are indignant when they hear what had happened. So there's lots of different things we can say about this. But before I get to the annotations, I want to point out one of the features is that I've brought in a lot of the existing stuff that the Digital Tolkien Project has already done. So one of the things that we've done is identifying all the sort of named entities, the people and places and groups and so on. And so I can toggle that on and bring in that data and say, show me the people, just as a helpful little visual cue. There's other things I can do. There's not an example of it here. I'll show you what one does in the next one. But one of the things you can do is split it into sentences, which are often useful in working out what the sort of flow of things are. You can put each sentence on its own line. They're probably the two most useful things, along with the first that I'll show you in the next chunk. But there's other things as well. The next one just bolds the verbs, which are helpful for just sort of scanning to see what the actions were. And you can also even do a interlinear display of the parts of speech, because one of the things that's been done is a part of speech analysis of the entire text, and that sometimes I think that'll be useful for future things. I'll go to the next one because I just want to show what one does. What one does is mutes the direct speech, because for the most part, for this kind of scene level annotation, we only care that somebody spoke. We don't care what they said, because we're interested in the action happening on the narrative mainline, not what they're talking about. So that's helpful to sometimes just mute that so you can focus on what the actual action is. And so we track who the characters are. And so for every single paragraph, we track who's there. Sometimes a paragraph will focus on just a subset of the characters. Like if all the fellowship is there, but Sam's just having a chat to Bill the pony, then we can say this is focused on Sam and Bill the pony. We can talk about whether characters have arrived or departed. We know who's speaking because of the speaker identification project that we did before. So all of that information's been brought in. And so, one of the things that Hannah, Sarah, and I have been doing is going through those 2 chapters so far and working out which character is present in every single paragraph. Also, what location it's taking place in. So in this case, Bilbo's room. But then we sort of have some higher level questions to do with, is a new location being established in this paragraph? Is there direct speech? Is there real-time action, or is this a summary? And yes, of course, you're absolutely right that this is going to vary potentially from edition to edition. I'll come to the role of different editions in this in a moment towards the end. But yes, obviously at the moment we're talking about annotating a particular edition. And to be honest, everything we do at the Digital Tolkien Project pretty much ultimately ends up being for a particular edition. And I would certainly love to apply this to other editions of Lord of the Rings and even drafts ultimately. But to be honest, it's such a big task even to do for a single edition that it's probably going to be a little while before we're annotating different editions. But I would dearly love to do that, because there would be some really interesting comparisons that could be made, not just in the actual words used, but in things like, is the movement of characters different? Is the style of action versus summary different, and so on. But yeah, so we ask these questions about, is there real-time action? Is there a summary over a short time scale, like minutes or hours? Or is there a larger summary going on over weeks, days or weeks? And if you look, we're going to be able to share some of this information very easily, as long as we don't share the text. So there's all sorts of potential visualizations we can do. It's really easy to see what parts of the text are summary, what parts are real-time scenes, and so on. But I just want to show you a couple of other things, and that has to do sort of with the management of the characters and locations. I'll just point out that you can, you can leave little notes as we're going through. We can leave little notes for one another about it. Sometimes that's useful for matters of interpretation as well. Some of this is not necessarily easy, and one of the things that I've definitely noticed, if I go back to the top and go into A Journey in the Dark, there's things that this forces you to read really, really closely. So we already talked before about what happened to Merry at the end of chapter 1, but there are other things as well that become really, really clear when you're forced to do this. So let me give you an example. Some of you may know this off the top of your head, but in A Journey in the Dark, right, there's a point where the Fellowship gets to the stair falls, and a subset of the Fellowship goes up to see what's going on and why the Cyrano River has dried up and so on. And they go up the stairs and see that it's basically the valleys, it's the dams formed and the valleys flooded and formed this lake. And they, on the opposite side of the lake is where the west gate of Moria is. And then that subset goes back down, and then all of them, including Bill the Pony, go up the sort of switchback to the north of the stairs. I don't think I'd ever paid much attention to exactly which were the characters that the initial characters that went up those stairs, and maybe some of you know off the top of your head, but and maybe some of you noticed, but I didn't. It turns out it was Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli are the 3 that go up the stairs, and I don't think I would have paid that much attention to that fact if not for the fact that I had to actually document that here. That was something that it forced me to do. And so I can actually go, I don't know if I should have, well, here's how I can find out where it was, because I can show you another feature. So one of the features is, and this is exciting because this is the kind of visualization that we can start sharing immediately. Let me first of all show you this visualization of the characters in this chapter. So this is a visualization of which characters appear in what paragraphs in this chapter. If it's a darker grey, it means they speak. And here you can clearly see this is the section where Gimli, Gandalf, and Frodo go off on their own. You can also see exactly the point at which Bill the Pony runs off and is no longer part of it. So yes, Bill the silent. That's right. Bill's the silent type. He doesn't say anything. It's actually interesting, even just getting a sense of who does the most. Gandalf obviously does the most speaking, but it's remarkable how quiet Aragorn is. For example, Boromir speaks more than Aragorn in this chapter. Sam speaks more than Aragorn in this chapter. But that's very easy to see what's going on here. And the other thing you can do, and by the way, we can click on a particular character to get all of the chunks where he appears, is mostly what that's focused on. But I want to go back and also show you the locations, because this is, I think, particularly interesting. One of the things we've done with the locations is organize them hierarchically. So we have Eriador, and then within Eriador we have Holland. Within Holland we have the Warg Hill. And there's a whole section where they're under the Warg Hill, and there's this section where they're on top of the Warg Hill. So all that's split up, right? The top of the Warg Hill is a location contained within Warg Hill, which is in Holland, which is in Eriador, and so on. And so you can see exactly where in the text they are in various locations. And this is actually one of the really exciting things that I'd not... when we started this, it was mostly just about doing this annotation, and then all of a sudden these visualizations possibilities became clear. And there's a lot of this stuff we'll be able to produce and make freely available, this kind of information, which I'm really excited about. And there's obviously tie-ins to... There's lots of links that could be made between this and projects that are geographically focused, like Artecraft. I'm really excited to sort of tie those together. Also, this ontology of locations can be tied to things like Tolkien Gateway and so on, that are obviously doing a lot of this work as well in working out how do you model locations within other locations and so on. So this was always something that we wanted to do at the Digital Tolkien Project, and finally we've kind of got an outlet for doing that kind of stuff. I think that's probably all, unless Hannah or Sarah, I've forgotten something. If I go into Arda, this is just a summary of who the characters and the locations are. I think I've probably shown everything. One thing I'll just quickly mention is that the annotators can report on the status of a paragraph. They can say, do they think it's done or not done or whatever. That's what these colors are referring to. So there's a lot of infrastructure between the notes and the logs and the marking completion and everything. There's a lot of infrastructure just around the annotations themselves, whatever the annotations are, and sort of verifying and reviewing other people's annotations and all that kind of stuff, tracking who's done what. All that sort of stuff is built into the system. Okay, so that is Rimbë. I will undoubtedly be doing more videos about this as more functionality is worked on. But I want to say a couple more things. One is that very quickly when you start talking about characters and locations and time, you start then wanting to relate... Oh, I should hide myself again because I'm in the way. You start thinking about family trees in the context of characters, maps in the context of locations, and timelines in the context of time. So one of the things that we'll definitely be doing is integrating in the modeling of timelines, maps as well, so being able to annotate where on the map particular locations are, as well as the relationships between characters and so on. Actually, not just family tree, but any kind of relationship between characters, such as the gardener relationship with Sam and Frodo and so on. There's some other things I've added here. Previously, I just had movement under location, but obviously description of locations and weather and stuff like that is additional information that we can annotate in the text that relates to these objects like characters, locations, and time. So there's a whole lot more that is going to be possible with this. I'll also just mention that because we've got all this infrastructure for annotation in general, this can actually be the basis for a lot of other annotations that we have planned. some of which you've seen me do with one-off little apps that I've written, but increasingly I'm going to build them into Rimbë because it's got all of the other infrastructure I need for these sorts of things. So significantly, excuse me, that's going to include things like OCR correction, which I'm hoping is going to be useful for a lot of people, where we have scans of, like, for example, other editions of books that we've OCR'd, but we have that process of going through and correcting the OCR. And I've been playing around with a couple of prototypes to do that sort of stuff, but now I can just build them in Rimbë and not have to worry about all of the sort of review infrastructure and account management and access and all that kind of stuff. Other kinds of transcriptions, for example, some of you would have seen the work I was doing with the documentaries and transcribing documentaries and identifying who the speakers were and so on. And I had a little app that I'd built for doing that. I'm going to put that in Rimbë. That's the right place to put it. You've also seen me do work on alignment, like aligning different the two major versions of the Huron poem, the Turin poem. And again, that alignment tool can go in Rimbë. There are other things like word sense disambiguation that will be important. There's some words that a couple immediately come to mind. So if you want to see when Merry is mentioned, Merry can be an adjective as well as the name of a Hobbit. So being able to go through and clearly indicate whether it's talking about the Hobbit or the adjective is helpful. Also, Gollum, the Little Delving that I just did yesterday included occurrences of Gollum. And somebody asked, does that include when the sound Gollum is given? And that's an example where we would want to go through and tag those differently. There's a lot of things in the Tolkien glossary where it would be helpful to know, it's got this, it uses this sense here and that sense there. And other kinds of semantic tagging as well. I know Rory has a lot of interest in doing the plant stuff, and this would be another great tool for annotating where plants are mentioned. And of course, this is also a tool for verse analysis as well in the poetry. And so certainly when the new collected verse books come out later this year, I'm looking forward to using Rimbë as a tool for doing that kind of markup as well. The question of how to deal with speech or noise from offstage, as it were. I mean, that's something that is probably worth distinguishing. Ultimately, we probably want to indicate all of it as long as we make the distinctions that are useful, depending on for particular research questions, may care or not care about it. And we've already sort of faced that with the speaker identification, just sort of relating to you mentioned the fox talking to himself, and there's all sorts of cases we already hit with the speaker identification where it's unclear. Is the person muttering to themselves? Is it completely an internal thought? So there's an interesting sort of taxonomy to come up with there for modelling that as well, because it depends on the research question partly. Like if you're interested in the style, then presumably it doesn't matter if they mutter it to themselves versus say it to someone else. If you're interested in how Sam speaks, then he talks to himself the same way that he talks to others. But in other cases, you do very much care for that distinction, who they're talking to. I mentioned before that whole idea of when does Gandalf and Aragorn contract their do-nots to don't? Does it depend on who they're talking to? I'd already done a little bit of work at one point a few years ago on like when Mr. versus Master is used and stuff like that. Because that's an interesting study, and that sort of stuff would be really fun to annotate. We did distinguish in the speaker ID spreadsheets between when it was obviously spoken out loud versus not allowed. We may need to have a richer taxonomy for that. One thing I didn't mention in the demo was the way we're probably going to need to have fairly rich modelling of time as well. So we have this hierarchical modelling of location. We'll probably want to do the same with time, because and it's a sort of a hierarchy of containment, or maybe even a graph, because you've got, sometimes you just know that it's in autumn, or you know that it's in late October. Sometimes you know it's the afternoon of this exact date. And I talked a little bit about that in my MythMoot 2021 talk, of how you can potentially model fuzzy dates as well as exact dates. And that's useful, by the way, not just for Lord of the Rings or something like that. If for example, in the Hammond and Skull chronology, they have exactly the same issue, right? You get entries that are specific dates, like the 29th of January 1954, but then you get others that would just say, the Michaelmas term or something like that, or summer or something like that, or somewhere between April 1st and April 15th or something. So we're not the first to encounter these issues, and there are ways for modeling that kind of time stuff that we'll incorporate. But anyway, that is, I guess I'll just finish up by saying that in many respects, all of these things, it's sort of funny, this is a diagram that I've had around for a while showing the various pieces of the Digital Tolkien Project. And it's interesting that scene segmentation just so happens to be in the middle of this, because what is become apparent in Rimbë started off as being a tool for just doing the scene segmentation. But I think it's actually going to be the center of all the annotation work we do. And it's going to feed into work on timelines and maps and genealogies. It relates very much to the name index and speaker identification. It's going to drive a lot of stuff in the Tolkien glossary and even Search Tolkien. Even the database of Tolkien-inspired art that I'd love to get back to. Rimbë is providing all of the things to which we want to attach information about art to, right? The database of Tolkien-inspired art was the idea there is to let artists sort of register that a particular work of theirs relates to a particular passage, but it could equally be a particular location or a particular character, so that people can search for what are the artists who have depicted this passage or this location or this character and so on, as a largely as a way of helping with art discovery, and people just discover new Tolkien art, but from the context of in the context of a particular aspect of the work, like a particular paragraph or whatever. Yes, and nominations for the Tolkien Society Art Awards can be tied to that too. So I'm really, really excited about Rimbë, because I think it's all of a sudden unlocked a way of moving forward in so many of the things that we had started doing in fits and spurts and we're planning on doing and so on. So my only disappointment is that I can't immediately give you all access to Rimbë. It's something that obviously I need to be very careful with. I think there will be a way of working with Rimbë that does not expose any text, even though it may be occasionally a little frustrating. It would do something like, say, go to the paragraph that starts with this word, sort of thing, with the citation number. And it will rely on people having the book open in front of them. But even with those limitations and that need to respect the rights of HarperCollins and the Tolkien estate, there's a tremendous amount of the results of the annotation that we can publicly share and make available, both in terms of the sort of visualization of the data. I'm looking forward to all sorts of visualizations we're going to be able to do about exactly where each character was and when. And one of the things I love about it is that it's so intimately tied to the text itself. So, lots of people have done diagrams of where the fellowship were at various points in time and when they split and when they joined. But I'm not aware of any that go down to the individual paragraph where that happened, and where's the evidence that this happened on this date, and where's that, all that sort of stuff. All that's going to be possible with this because all the annotations are so deeply tied to the text. So I think there's going to be lots of fun visualizations we can do, but I'm also hoping that the raw data is useful for others as well, both scholars and also content creators who want to produce their own visualizations and their own kind of exploration of this stuff using this data. So there'll hopefully be lots of opportunities for people that do want to be involved in any of these annotations. There's going to be lots of types of annotations, as I said, that we can do on this, not just the scene segmentation. Anyway, that's, I think, about it from me. Thank you very much, everyone who joined the live stream live, and thank you everyone who watched this far in the post recording. As always, if you want to participate in any way, I strongly encourage you to join the Discord, where most of the discussion happens, and there'll be a link in the description. There already is a link in the description, and thank you for watching. If you feel like it, please subscribe, so you don't miss out on anything. And of course, I would deeply love it if you consider joining as a member of the channel. But I'll see you in the Discord or in the next video I do, the next live stream. Thanks everyone for joining me.